moderator today is Donna Hoffman. She's an associate professor and head of the Department of Political Science at the University of Northern Iowa, and proud to say, again, bringing in other Regents Institution members into our fold today, and we really appreciate her joining us. She has earned her PhD in political science at the University of Oklahoma, and she teaches courses in Congress, the presidency, and campaigns and elections, and her research interests are in the area of American politics, political rhetoric and presidential rhetoric and electoral behavior, which obviously is perfect for this. So Donna, thank you very much.
Well, welcome to the first panel of the day. We have a very distinguished panel for this morning's session on campaign finance, corporate giving, and the Citizens United lawsuit. As Pete mentioned, I'm Donna Hoffman. I'm at the University of Northern Iowa, and I'll be moderating this event. And I'd like to begin with just a few words on the subject of campaign financing. If I ever want to see my students' eyes glaze over, I start talking about campaign financing and campaign financing reform. And maybe that's why they asked me to moderate this panel today instead of actually present something on it. But be that as it may, this topic is really, truly an important one, and also one that is really complex. And I maintain this is why my students' eyes glaze over, not because of me. But there are contribution limits in some areas, unlimited financing in other aspects, public financing, partial public financing, FEC regulations, independent expenditures, electioneering communications, and the list of complexities could go on. In 2010, the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United versus the FEC brought even new complexities to this area that affected then the 2010 midterm elections. A recent study by the Campaign Finance Institute found that independent expenditures and electioneering communications by non-party groups in the 2010 congressional elections increased 130% from 2008. Another study has reported that a majority of advertising spending by both the 527 groups as well as the 501c entities in 2010 went to fund negative advertising. So part of the question to be explored today on this panel is unpacking some of the complexities in regard to campaign financing, as well as the effects, positive and negative, on political discourse. So with that, I'm going to introduce the three panelists. They'll come up in the order that I introduced them, but I want to introduce them all at one time, and then they can continue with their remarks. And at the end of their remarks, we'll have time for questions, hopefully, as well. So our first panelist this morning will be Randall Bezanson. He is the David H. Vernon Professor of Law at the University of Iowa. Professor Bezanson earned a Bachelor of Science degree from Northwestern and his Juris Doctorate from the University of Iowa. He clerked for Judge Robb on the U.S. Courts of Appeals and for U.S. Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun. Besides being a faculty member at the University of Iowa, Professor Bezanson has served as vice president at the university, as well as dean of the Washington and Lee School of Law. His teaching centers on constitutional law, freedom of speech and press, and mass communications law. He is the author or co-author of several books, including the forthcoming Is There Such a Thing as Too Much Free Speech? Professor Bezanson's remarks will be entitled, Does Citizens United Matter? Our second panelist will be Professor Fred Boehmke, and he's an associate professor of political science at the University of Iowa and a member of the new Social Science Research Center. He was a Robert Wood Johnson Scholar in health policy research at the University of Michigan. Professor Boehmke's research focuses mainly on the consequences, intended and unintended, of direct democracy on interest groups. He is the author of The Indirect Effect of Direct Legislation, How Institutions Shape Interest Group Systems. Professor Boehmke's remarks today will address money in politics. What does $1 buy? And finally, we will hear from David Orentlicher. He is an MD and a JD, who is professor and co-director of the Center for Law and Health at Indiana School of Law in Indianapolis. During the 2010 academic year, he was a visiting professor at the University of Iowa College of Law. A graduate of Harvard Law School and Harvard Medical School, he previously served as director of the Division of Medical Ethics at the American Medical Association. He was also on the adjunct faculty of the University of Chicago Law School and Northwestern University Medical School. In addition to his work in healthcare law, Professor Orentlicher teaches and writes on controversies in constitutional law, including affirmative action, separation of powers, and partisan conflict. His current research includes a forthcoming book on the presidency. Professor Orentlicher served in the Indiana House of Representatives from 2002 to 2008, and his remarks this morning will address Citizens United from the perspective of the professor legislator. So with that, I'll let the panelists come up and do their presentations.
The topic that I'm going to try to address and get us kind of all clear about for starters, is the Citizens United case. This is the case that President Obama criticized in the State of the Union address, and Justice Alito on the Supreme Court, for reasons that I simply cannot fathom, expressed shock and awe that the president would criticize that decision or describe it for what he said it did, which it did. The Citizens United decision needs to be understood, though, and some of the lessons of knowing about it may teach us something about the topic that we're talking about here, which is politics and political discourse and the like. The Citizens United case dealt with a very small little piece of the McCain-Feingold campaign finance law, a piece that I particularly loved for reasons unrelated to this. It was a piece that said within 30 days in advance of a primary election, or 60 days of a regular election, but this was a primary, all of the noise coming from corporations and unions had to stop. You know, shout, yell, talk, spend, all of that, up to 60 days or 30 days. And then let's have a little peace and quiet, because people have to kind of digest things and hopefully vote in a thoughtful way. And as I want to say when I talk about Citizens United, actually we might even be able to hear the candidates speak. Because in campaign finance reform in this country, the largest victim of that reform has been the political candidate, who now has so little money and so little capacity for raising money that it's just all the other actors without those constraints that spend and that speak. And so we don't hear from the candidates the way we probably ought to, which is mostly, I would think. So the question in the case was Congress having prohibited corporations and unions from speaking through independent expenditures during this 30-day period. Congress having done that, does the Constitution prohibit Congress enacting that law and require that it be stricken as unconstitutional under the First Amendment? That is a restriction of free speech. And the Supreme Court said yes to that. The law restricts speech, independent expenditures, primarily, and therefore it is unconstitutional. It matters not that the object of the law was speech by corporations and unions. They're just like everybody else, including you and me, individuals who have the liberty of speech and free will, actually. Not so clear that corporations have free will. It is, and I won't explain why I say this, it is a terrible decision in constitutional law. But that's not what we're interested in here. And I could, give you a lecture as I have elsewhere in the legal environment about the legal problems in this case and with the Supreme Court these days, for that matter. But to keep the case in focus, let me just say two more things. First, what's this independent expenditure stuff? Or as Donna said, the 501c3-4s, blah, 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 super PACs, all of that sort of stuff. In election law, there is a distinction between contributions to candidates or speaking on behalf of candidates for the candidates in coordination with the candidates. It's one kind of speech activity. And on the other hand, independent activities that consist largely of independent expenditures for speech. Independent expenditures have for many years been excluded from the restrictions on the amount of campaign money that can be raised, on other controls in the political campaign finance system, on the behavior of candidates and those allied with them. It's purely independent speech. Okay? So that's basically what we're talking about here when we talk about Citizens United. Secondly, in holding that corporations and unions could not be prohibited from speaking during this period, the court issued a very broad decision that says corporations and unions are full First Amendment rights holders. That's what has shocked the legal world in some quarters and certainly shocked the public imagination. But that is a real exaggeration. Before Citizens United, corporations, like everybody else, could speak. You don't need a license to speak in this country. The only question is, when the government comes down with a heavy hand, will the First Amendment protect you? So we've had corporate speech. We will have corporate speech, and there's not a lot we can do about it. Maybe some things, but not a lot. Secondly, before Citizens United, the corporations who many people think are the worst actors, that is to say, charitable organizations, people of great wealth who want to influence elections, all of those people, they use the corporate form. And they were protected by the First Amendment under the Supreme Court's decision when they did it. So the fact of the matter is, when the Citizens United case came to the Supreme Court, the question was not whether we could shut down these ideological organizations or these affiliations among interest groups that are setting up super PACs and all of that sort of stuff. No. That was already clear that you couldn't shut that down. Those were fully protected speakers. So what did Citizens United do? At one level, this is a gross exaggeration, but there is enough truth to it that we need to pay attention. At one level, the court expanded First Amendment protection for speakers in the political arena who, by and large, don't want to speak. Because every corporation that wanted to speak, every foundation that wanted to speak, whatever it was, they already could speak, and they were fully protected under existing case law before Citizens United. Who does Citizens United hit most? Unions, and they're starting to feel that really strongly. Is that how much I got left? Okay, thanks. Unions and business corporations. I kind of like business corporations, you know, they're pretty important to us in this economy and all. The fact of the matter is, most business corporations don't want to speak on behalf of candidates. And they hadn't been speaking. And when they did occasionally, if you remember the Target case in Minnesota, where Target endorsed kind of a candidate, and Target's shareholders and customers went crazy in outrage that the corporation would do that. The corporation they owned, and Target backed off, said, sorry, we didn't mean it, and if we did, we don't mean it anymore. We're not going to do that anymore. Big punishment for corporations, business corporations, who have their stock in the markets and stuff like that, if they start diddling around in corporate speech, I mean in political speech, through independent expenditures. So, in one respect, our central question, does Citizens United matter? My answer is no. On the quantum and nature of speech in the electoral process. Quantum may go up some, may go down, who knows, but it was going up before, and it'll keep going up in a free society where we protect free speech. Now, why do I say the corporations, business corporations, who now have First Amendment protection for their speech that they didn't have before, and I won't explain the details, but there are reasons there. Why do I say that they don't want to speak? Well, one, they're deterred because their customers and their owners, their shareholders, are going to be plenty mad at them. I've invested in this company. I've got shares in this company. This company's supposed to do good business, make me money on my stock, generate earnings. Forget the political stuff. That has nothing to do with it. They are not incentivized to want to engage in the political process. So why do they? This is my third point. I'm getting toward the end here. Why do they? If you talk to a lot of them, the business executives and the investment people and all of that, they will say, because we're trapped. We are caught in a political structure in this country by which the political actors demand the money. And the people who have their interests they want to protect in the political system are basically held hostage. How many companies do you talk to that say, well, we give the same amount to Democrats and Republicans? Well, why would you do that? Well, we got to give them some, you know, or we can't talk to them, or they're not going to listen to our arguments, or something like that. We have a problem in this political system that's leading to a lot of ills in our election system, whose source is not corporations or corporate speech or too much money in politics as such. Its source is the system is incentivized to force people to spend money in the system by a political system that sells public policy. That's the politicians. And the needs of the politicians in the system. Without fundamental restructuring of the appetite of the political system for money, no significant change is going to take place. Now I'm done, except to ask one final question here. Does Citizens United matter in this particular respect? Does corporate speech on behalf of candidate X, A, or B, or cause C, or D, does it matter? If the question of whether it matters is whether we, the voters, are hoodwinked by it, I'm not a political scientist, so I'm looking forward to what's going to be said here. But from what I've read and what I know, which could be precious little, I don't think there's any evidence, no data, that it makes a difference. The money's being wasted. And indeed, the corporations are in effect telling us that by saying, well, we got to spend it. We got to give it. We got to make sure the candidate knows, although the candidate can't control, but that candidate knows, so we have a seat at the public policy table. That's what's being sold, is public policy. I don't think we're being bought as voters. Maybe we are. Maybe there are a bunch of us who just think, well, if GM says so, so be it. But I don't think so. So I'm not sure focusing on tons of corporate speech, which probably wouldn't happen without the appetite of the political system, does us a lot of good here if we're worried about the amount of speech and the kind of speech and all of that sort of thing in elections. I don't think it matters, because I'd give us some more. We'll still make our same decisions. So that's what I have to say. Thank you.
What I'd like to talk a little bit about today is kind of the academic view, the political science view about the role of money in politics. I kind of view my job in the classroom, and perhaps I'll adopt a bit of that today, as to be somewhat of a naysayer. So people often come in very concerned about the role of money in politics and about, you know, what's being bought and seats at the table and all that. And I like to at least provide the counter perspective that perhaps it's not necessarily as bad as everyone thinks it is. And it doesn't mean that it's a good thing. It doesn't mean that I think this is the only way to think about it, but just to kind of put that perspective out there. I picked this image because this is how I think about campaign finance reform. Every time you plug one hole, another one's going to open up. Right? So you got all your Band-Aids up there, and that could be BICRA, that could be the Lobbying Reform Act, that could be all sorts of things. Groups that want to get money in politics for whatever reason are going to find another way to do it. They'll create 527s, those will become a big deal, and then they'll create super PACs. So as much as the politicians try and keep up with the system at the same time that they perhaps both benefit and do not benefit from them, from the system, they are faced with this problem that it's very difficult to find a way to keep money out of politics. So given that, I think it's important to ask, what role does money play in the political system? So I think the question that everyone wants answered is, well, maybe not in this room, but I think this is the fundamental question here is, you know, what do you get for your money? Does it buy votes? There's, of course, the more general question about the role of money in campaigns. I tend to agree that certainly it matters a little bit, but it doesn't necessarily buy a bunch of votes in the broader electorate. What I would like to discuss is whether or not this money is buying votes in Congress. Whether or not we're getting different kinds of legislation and such. This is, I think, one of the better cartoons I could find out there, and given the role of political cartoons in the Civil Discourse Symposium, I thought it might be nice to contribute to that. This is an example. This is not of a legislator, but of a judge, but you get the idea, and it involves tobacco. And tobacco has been one of the most prominent examples of people trying to understand the question of the role of money in politics, partly because of the fact that the tobacco industry has over the years given a lot of money to politicians. So from an academic point of view, from a political science point of view, I can summarize it this way. It's really, really hard for us to show that money matters in the legislative process, that a corporation that gives $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 actually gets something in terms of a change in someone's vote for that. Why is that? Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. And let me also add that it's not like we as political scientists are not interested in finding that out, because I think most of us believe that there is a role that money plays in terms of influencing how people vote. I think most of our students think that. I think most of us, somewhere deep down, think that at least some of the time it does matter. And the person that's able to come up with the right research design or the right way to ask the question that is able to show that it matters, I think that there's actually a reward for that. So we're not reaching this conclusion because we're trying to hide something or not. And a lot of creative people have taken their turn at trying to answer this question. Part of the reason why I think that if you have some sort of analysis where you consider how much money groups are giving and how people vote on a given bill that you very rarely find an effect is because there's lots and lots of other things going on. Obviously, there are groups lobbying on both sides of the issue, and that may or may not cancel it out. As Representative Loebsack mentioned earlier, there are lots of different interests in a single district, and somebody has to account for those different interests. And if they get $20,000 or $30,000 from some business PAC and then they vote exactly opposite to the interests of their constituency, they're probably going to have a day of reckoning on that. Okay? Votes are very difficult things to buy, partly because there's one vote on an issue, or there's a couple amendments perhaps, but that's a record. That's something you have to run on, and it'll be pretty easy if you get $20,000 the day before a vote and all of a sudden vote in a way that doesn't make sense. People will point that out with all this campaign spending that we've talked about a little bit here. Another thing to note is that the only way you can give money directly to a candidate is as a person, and there's a relatively low limit on that. I think it's around $2,500 right now, or as a PAC, and the PAC limit is about $5,000 per election cycle. PACs are really hard to run. They're really expensive, and they can't give that much money. And so most PACs don't really give a lot of money. I think most of the money is given by somewhere around the top 10% of them, and there's only about 5,000 PACs in the country, and that number has not changed that much. So it's actually very difficult to give this kind of money because of all the regulations and reporting requirements. That does not mean that there's not lots of other money in the system. PAC money is actually somewhere around 25% of spending in elections, maybe even a little bit lower these days. Okay, so what is the mystery here and why do we use tobacco? Well, one of the first articles that was written on this used tobacco as a case to say, look, all these people that voted for these anti-tobacco, that voted against these anti-tobacco measurements got lots and lots of money from the tobacco industry. Therefore, the money has caused them to vote that way. As we've noted earlier, it's much more complicated than that, but in particular, I think the principal thing to note is that you have to ask yourself, how would those people have voted without that tobacco money? Do we think that a representative from North Carolina, from a tobacco growing district, would have voted against it? That is, for the anti-tobacco position. That's very unlikely, even if that money's not given, because of the composition of that person's district. And so the role of ideology plays a big part here. And I think that in the end, most of the money goes to people that have a similar ideological disposition as the group contributing the money. That's not surprising, but that makes you wonder exactly how much the group has persuaded that person to behave differently. I do think that it does matter, and there is evidence that shows that it can matter. But to change a big vote in the House, for example, you have to buy dozens and dozens and dozens of people. And that gets really expensive really quickly, and given the limits on these PAC contributions, that becomes very difficult to make happen. I think the best way to summarize the literature on this in political science is to say that we think probably it does matter. Maybe it matters on votes that no one's paying much attention to, and maybe it can matter in really, really close votes where there's a small chance that the contributions may have made a difference. Okay, so another way that we've kind of thought about this question in the discipline is to talk about how much money there is in politics. Given all the things I said and what was said earlier about the effect of spending on campaigns and such, people often talk about how much money there is in politics, right? And so we've got a relatively small stack of money here. But if money is buying these big bills and these big votes and it's changing all of these things, how come we don't have that stack of money in the political process? I ran some calculations this morning. If you look at total spending in the 2009-2010 election cycle, it was about $4 billion. Actually it was perhaps a little bit less than that, but close enough. Candidates, PACs, individuals, independent expenditures, everything that they could find, Open Secrets, which is a great resource, put a number somewhere in the high 3 billions. That sounds like a lot of money to me, right? That probably hopefully sounds like a lot of money to you out there. That's about $15 to $20 per person in this country, okay? Or actually, sorry, per registered voter, I think. In that sense, it's actually not that money. Every vote costs about $20. I mean, and by cost, I mean that's how much is spent per vote in an election. I don't think that's a huge amount of money. Or put a different way, the people that are advocating for public financing of campaigns, it would only require about $20 per person, although there have obviously been some trouble implementing clean election laws or public financing in some of the states. So it's hard to say if that's even feasible these days. Another way I thought about it was, over the last couple of years, we have had some really, really big bills, right? Like the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the bailouts. Those are measured in trillions of dollars for a single bill. On any given bill, there's probably a few $100 million of lobbying that's being done. If you think about it in terms of the scale of the benefit that these groups can get from the legislation and how much is being spent to try and influence the decision, they're totally out of scale. If you were a business and you were worried about something that might be worth billions of dollars to you, you might spend more than $100 million on it. That's a relatively small percentage. To return to the Carmeier example, which is not, again, it's not a legislative example, but you're talking about a case where this decision affected Philip Morris somewhere in the neighborhood of $10 billion. Philip Morris, I think, gave him about $16,000. Some affiliated groups gave a bit more, probably about $1 million. But $1 million for something that's worth billions and billions of dollars, okay? If it really was worth that much and you really could buy that much with money, you'd think that there'd be a lot more of it. There's actually an interesting political science article called "Why is there so little money in politics?" or "Why is there not more of it?" And I think that that's a good question to ask and something that we should probably continue to think about and something that I think puts an important perspective on this. I wanted to conclude by talking a little bit more about the broader context and also what I think is worth looking at a little bit here. As I mentioned, there's somewhere around $3.7 billion spent in the 2009-2010 election cycle. PACs are, again, a relatively small proportion of that. Independent expenditures are a small proportion of that. Candidates, which are getting some money from PACs, and of course have some of their own money, as well as individual contributions are a reasonable amount of that, okay? But I left out one category there because I want to make the point that when you add lobbying, which is not the campaign stuff, but what's reported, and the lobbying money, if you know the rules, is probably a severe understatement of how much is spent because it only includes very limited definitions of lobbying, excluding all sorts of grassroots lobbying. That's what you see. Now remember, that top category is the sum of all those categories except lobbying and some other stuff. That lobbying category over a 2-year period is over twice as much, or about twice as much as the total spent on elections. My personal, after having worked on this for a few years and looking at this more and more, I think that even more attention should be spent to the role of lobbying because votes may be very difficult to influence. I'm not saying they're impossible, but they may be very difficult. But getting someone to show up to a committee hearing to maybe insert a clause into a bill or to try and bottle a bill up in a committee, you only need one person to do that. And it can be a lot cheaper because you only have to influence that one person. You can send a lobbyist. There are no limits on the total amount that could be spent on lobbying, and your lobbyist can assist those people. They can perhaps prepare drafts, versions of legislation, proposed language. They can really do a lot of work that could help somebody out, a legislator, or could help out people advocating for a particular position. So I'm of the opinion that instead of worrying so much about the campaign contribution stuff, where these are all resulting in ads and flyers and stuff that show up in our mailboxes, we should think a little bit more, or at least not that we don't think about it at all, but we should think even more about the role of lobbying. We talk about lobbying and what goes on, but I don't think we know nearly as much as we should about it. And part of that is because of the way the reporting requirements. They're very different for lobbying. It's very difficult to figure out how much lobbying was spent on a given issue, how much lobbying was spent on a given bill, and mostly because groups are only required to report aggregate lobbying totals over 6 months, 12 months, and it's very difficult to link the spending to the actual issue. Another reason why I think it's worth thinking about lobbying a little bit more is because most of the time there actually isn't that much lobbying on most bills. There's a tiny bit, maybe a few groups. This is just kind of the distribution of groups lobbying across policies. The important thing to notice here is that for those first 50 or 60% of issues, there's very, very few groups lobbying on them. So most of the lobbying that goes on is 1 or 2 groups. That means there's not voices on both sides. And when there are a few groups on these small issues, most of the time, it's just groups representing one side of the equation. There are, of course, a few really, really big ones, right? If you go look up, I think it was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act had twice as much lobbying activity in 2009 as the next bill. So you get these 2 or 3 issues, which may have been health care. Actually, it was something related to Afghanistan. You get these 2 or 3 issues that are huge, and then a lot of stuff where there's not that much attention. People don't pay attention to it, and they think that what's going on in those 2 big issues is indicative of the entire system, but it's not. It's mostly a bunch of small groups getting together and talking about stuff. And having an opportunity to basically have only 1 or 2 voices heard in the lobbying process. So this is actually some data that I have. These are also from Wisconsin, although not necessarily related to what we heard earlier. The previous information was about the number of groups. This is about the hours. And Wisconsin, one of the really nice things about Wisconsin is that they have really good reporting laws on lobbying activity. You can link a lot more things and get a lot more information. So this is the same, constructed the same way. This chart is the number of groups. This one is the hours spent on lobbying. I think this is maybe the 2003-2004 session. The story is even worse when you look at lobbying hours, right? So it's even more skewed. There's 2 or 3 issues that have a huge amount of activity, and then all those tiny issues, there's only 1 or 2 groups, or a very small number of hours being lobbied on those issues. Okay, so I'm going to conclude there, and I think that will bring me in right about on time. Again, the purpose of what I've tried to show here is not to say that none of this stuff matters, but to say that I think it's important to not overstate the effect of this, and also to make sure that when we think about the role of money in politics, we look at the areas where it's likely to have the bigger influence and where it's most likely to lead to perhaps distortions in the policy-making process. And I don't necessarily think that campaign finance and campaign spending is the area where you get most of those distortions coming about. Thanks.
I'm going to reinforce a number of things that Randy and Fred said and add So the 3 points I want to make. As Randy indicated, Citizens United, what it actually did was not that big a deal. It was much more important for the symbolism of the opinion, the decision, than for its substance. I think there is a big problem with corporate campaign spending, so I'll disagree a little bit with Fred, but it's not, to the extent it's a problem, it's not because of Citizens United. This is Wisconsin Day. We really should be mad at Wisconsin Right to Life. That was the bad decision. My second point will be the campaign finance reforms often address symptoms rather than causes. As long as people care so much about elections, they'll find a way to fund them. As Fred said, you push it down, you whack one mole, it just pops up somewhere else. Unless we go to the British system, I think the model of no paid broadcasting for elections, the government reserves time, there are campaign spending limits. If we go the British way and amend our Constitution, that's how we would solve it. And then I want to talk about how some campaign finance reforms can be counterproductive. Contribution limits may make sense when you're talking about a large, the Cook brothers who can spend millions of dollars, but when we're talking about small dollar people, the $2,500 limit that Fred mentioned can make it very difficult for people to break into the system and really puts up barriers to the challenger. At least that was my experience. And disclosure. Thresholds can do the same thing. We should have disclosure. The problems with these 501Cs that was mentioned that I'll talk about, where you can hide what you're doing, that's bad. But again, for the small dollar donor, there may be good reasons not to worry about disclosure. Okay, so first, Citizens United. As Randy says, this really is a small piece of the pie, because before Citizens United, these companies could engage in issues advocacy. It's just that they weren't allowed to do express advocacy, where they were actually saying, supposedly the distinction between talking about issues and saying vote for or against a candidate. And it was only about these independent expenditures, right? If you coordinated with a campaign or you gave to a campaign, there were pretty strict limits. But so you're spending independently, and it's on issues advocacy. And let me just show you some issues advocacy ads, because I'm having trouble telling the difference between an issues ad and an ad against a candidate. So here's one from the Rand Paul.
Kentucky values are being threatened on economic issues like coal and agriculture. Rand Paul is opposed to helping farmers and calls coal the least favorable form of energy. Kentucky's great military families would be surprised to know what Paul thinks of a nuclear Iran.
Security is not threatened by Iran having one nuclear weapon.
And on creating Kentucky jobs, what does Rand Paul say? Tell Rand Paul to stand up for real Kentucky values. American Future Fund is responsible for the content of this advertising.
American Future Fund's one of those 501Cs. Now notice they didn't say vote against Rand Paul, they said call Rand Paul and tell him what you think. So because they said call Rand Paul and tell him what you think, they got that doesn't count as express advocacy, that's issues advocacy. And there it is. I'll give you another one.
Issues comparison. Scott Brown supports an across-the-board tax cut. Martha Coakley says, quote, "We need to get taxes up." Brown has pledged not to raise taxes. Coakley says she will. Brown opposed the $2 trillion congressional spending spree that's putting us deeper in debt. Coakley supports massive new spending and the tax increases to pay for it. Call Martha Coakley and tell her we can't afford more taxes. American Future Fund is responsible for the content of this ad.
Okay, so again, American Future Fund, 501C. They didn't tell you to vote against Martha Coakley or vote for Scott Brown. They told you to call Martha Coakley. Anyway, the complexity that Donna talked about. Oh my gosh, there it is. So the corporations, they could get around the limits. They could just run all those ads they wanted, even before Citizens United. It was Wisconsin Right to Life in 2007 that blew open the door for these kinds of ads. And they came up with a standard only if the ad is susceptible of no reasonable interpretation other than as an appeal to vote for or against a specific candidate. then you can't do it within the 30 or 60 days. But since they had that tagline, they're off the hook. As Randy said, the other thing, the corporations, that deters the other thing for corporations, they don't want to alienate their customers. And here's an excerpt from a Washington Post article about Target giving money to this fund, this pro-business group, thinking they would back candidates who support lower taxes, and then they get into trouble because Tom Emmer, who was the Republican nominee, was in favor of a ban on same-sex marriage, and Target got caught up and regretted the spending. So to have an effect from Citizens United, two things would have to be true: that either corporations were afraid, well, if I run those ads that I think are issues advocacy, the FEC will claim it's express advocacy, or maybe they really want to say vote for Scott Brown rather than call Martha Coakley. And then they'd have to be able to hide what they want to do through these 501(c)s. But Citizens United had nothing to do with the ability to hide. That's Congress's fault. Congress screwed up when they wrote the rules for 501(c)s. If you have a 527, if you have a PAC, if you have any of these other groups, you got to disclose. But you do it through a 501(c), then you're off the hook. No disclosure. And in fact, Citizens United said disclosure is important, because that was one of the claims by the plaintiffs, that these disclosure rules are unconstitutional, and the court said no, disclosure is important. So instead of vilifying the Supreme Court, Obama should have vilified Congress, said go rewrite those 501(c) rules. Well, he should have vilified them for Wisconsin right to life. So now it is true, as I think one of the graphs you saw, that there is more corporate money in federal elections, but that, as Randy said and Fred indicated, this all started before Citizens United. It really started in 2008. So if you're going to connect it with the Supreme Court case, it's really Wisconsin right to life. But so there was an increase in spending, no doubt about that. And importantly, a big decrease in donor disclosure. So in 2010, only about half of dollars from the non-party groups. Right? So you have candidate spending, party spending, and then these outside non-party groups. Only half of that money, where it's coming from, is being disclosed. And again, that's Wisconsin right to life, not Citizens United. The other thing that happened in 2010 is this non-party outside spending eclipsed party spending for the first time. Candidate spending is still way above everybody else, aggregate. But the non-party has gone ahead of the party spending. And there's this nice article that I mentioned, Diana Dwyer, after Citizens United. If you go to ssrn.com, Social Science Research Network, where scholars post their papers, you can get her paper. It's a very nice paper where she looks at the data. So there has been what we have seen is this shift in spending as we keep these restrictions on candidates, how much they can raise and how much parties can raise, but we let the non-party, the corporations and labor unions do whatever they want, how much they can raise and spend. Then you see a shift. And candidates, so even though candidates spending still dwarfs outside spending now is taken over from party in the aggregate. And if you look at the competitive races, this is one of the things Dwyer does, if you look at the most competitive races, you can see that non-party outside spending exceeds candidate spending. So these outside groups can now are taking over certain races, even if in the aggregate they're not as big a deal. Getting back to Fred's point, yeah, it's $20 per vote overall, but they target their money. And when they target their money, they can make a difference. So the first point is Citizens United may be a rallying point, but the problems are elsewhere. The second is campaign spending is as much a symptom and we're focusing on the symptoms rather than the problems. Because there are a lot of reasons why people want to spend money. The presidential elections have become much more important as we have what scholars call the imperial presidency. The framers thought we'd have a balance between presidents and Congress, but the power has shifted. The framers thought, for example, just a simple one, is that Congress would declare war, and President Obama unilaterally took us into Libya. And it is a war, despite what he claims. All right. That's the imperial presidency. So as we've concentrated power in the president, and it's for a 4-year term, unlike a parliamentary system where you can bring down the government at any time, there's a lot at stake. The growth of the federal budget, Congress has a lot of money, and Fred's lobbying point I think is very important. As Congress has more money to spend, the corporations care, and the partisan divide. As the public has become more polarized by party, they're not more polarized overall, it's just they align more according to party. You don't have the conservative Democrats and the liberal Republicans anymore. So there's just much more at stake with our elections, and then we're going to get spending. Maybe we should have more, but it's gone a lot. So if you look at Jimmy Carter compared to President Obama and how much they spent, even adjusting for inflation, you still get an 8-fold increase in the amount that Obama spent compared to Carter. Okay, my third point is I said sometimes, while I'm all in favor of going to the British system and having more regulations, some of our regulations I think are counterproductive. So the broad disclosure is great. I want people to know if the Cook brothers are spending millions of dollars. But for the small dollar person, you know, maybe we shouldn't worry so much whether it's 2,000 or 5,000 or 10,000, because there are going to be people who want to donate to a candidate but don't, as Fred said, don't want to alienate their customers. And Randy said, it's true about Target, but it's also true about the small business person. You know, when I went to some of my friends and asked them to contribute, one guy just ran, you know, a couple shoe stores. He's not a big mega corporation, but he didn't want to alienate his customers and his friends. Or I had another friend who, you know, didn't want to start getting besieged, because the first time he gave to me, he did get on these lists, and he didn't want his name on lists. So he said, sorry, I can't do it again. Or then maybe you want to run for election, or you are an elected official, and you happen to like somebody on the other side of the aisle, or maybe somebody in a primary, the party leadership, and you want to give, but if you want to support that person, that's why we don't tell you who, you know, we get a secret ballot. So the same concerns about secret ballots carry over to contributions. So I think we shouldn't worry about the small dollar contributions so much. And then low contribution limits. When you're a challenger, and you know, I'm reluctant as a professor to rely on anecdotes, because sometimes, as Fred's indicated, sometimes your sort of instincts can lead you astray, and the plural of anecdote is not data. That said, I can say that comparing my race running as a challenger in a state representative race, not having contribution limits, because Indiana has the most, you know, limited campaign contribution rules, not having to deal with campaign contributions allowed me to be a viable candidate. Because here's one way where money matters. Early in races, the pundits, the political reporters, an important way in which they measure the viability of a candidate is how much money have they raised. Because there's not much else to go on. And because I could go to my friends and family and get $5,000 or $10,000 from a few of them, I was able to instantly, you know, become a viable candidate. And that was very important. And when I ran for Congress and had the 2,500 limit, so people who were willing to give me 10 or 20,000 couldn't. It really made it difficult for me to, as a, you know, sort of going against the sort of the favored candidate. It was very, very hard to mount a successful race with those kinds of limits. And there's also a built-in limit. If I went to somebody, there might have been somebody who would have given me $50,000, but that just doesn't look good on your report, because then people will discount. You know, you can be viable if you raise 100,000 from, you know, nobody gives you more than 2,000 or 5,000, but if you're raising 100,000 from 3 or 4 people, it just doesn't look good, and the media spin is not going to be so great. And of course, higher limits help incumbents too, but there's a diminishing return to increased spending, as long as you get above a threshold amount so you can be competitive. So That's my concern. We should worry about, you know, as I say, the Cook brothers, to pick on somebody, but we shouldn't worry about the small donors. And let me just, I know I'm running out of time, but I just want to comment on Fred's lobbying point, because that's so important. The influence. That was one of the things that shocked me when I became a member of a legislature. And I'll give you a couple anecdotes, but the first one is a week or two into the session, I get a call from an interest group saying, would you come down to a press conference we're holding on a bill. This was long-term care, to improve our long-term care funding in Indiana. And I'm thinking, you know, I haven't read the bill, and how can I go and speak about it? I'm an ethicist, right? So I thought about it. I said, okay, I can do this. I can just talk about, in general, about the importance of the issue, and the author of the bill can talk about specifics. So I said, sure, I'll do that. So I get down there for the press conference, and the author of the bill says to me, David, would you go first? I think, first? It's not my bill. So I get up, I speak for a couple minutes on the importance of the issue at a general level, nothing I couldn't, you know, be comfortable saying, and to my relief, nobody asked any questions. And then the author of the bill got up and spoke for half as much as I did, and then said, pointed to some of the audience, said, John, would you come up here and talk about the bill? And for the rest of the press conference, a special interest advocate explained the bill, took all the questions. And this happened in committee after committee. An author of a bill would stand up and could not explain the bill. And somebody else would call on an advocate to explain the bill. And as our euphemism was, people didn't say legislators wrote bills or drafted bills. Legislators carry bills because somebody else writes them. And money does matter. There's one particular, you know, the Indiana Chamber of Commerce. When I had a bill that I got through that had to do with labor relations, and then I had to go over to the Senate and get it passed. So I'd go to the chair of the committee that was going to hear it. And I said, you know, will you please hear my bill? Because that's what you've got to do. And then I went back, I thought, I've done my job. And then one of my co-legislators says, that's not enough. You got to go speak to the lobbyist for the Indiana Chamber of Commerce, because the lobbyist for the Indiana Chamber of Commerce decides the agenda for that committee. And there's lots more stories I could give about that. So Fred's right. If we just focus on the influence at the election time, that's not enough, because a lot happens behind closed doors. And I don't know why the press didn't report on the fact that legislators can't explain their bills and lobbyists have to do it. That's just stunning to me that the press ignores that. But anyway, I look forward to your questions, and thank you for having me today.
I guess the first thing that I would recommend is a vast improvement in the reporting requirements. The Lobbying Disclosure Act, as I mentioned, only requires very aggregate, I believe it's 6-month period reporting. You don't even have to list specific bills that you're lobbying on. You have to pick one of about 77 or 78 broad issue categories that might be defense or health or transportation. I think that if you had as much information about spending on lobbyists as you did about the campaign finance stuff, where you know the date, you know the exact amount, you know who it was given to, and you can kind of put everything together, I think that would at least be helpful from the point of view of rooting out what I think generally is viewed as the motivation for contribution limits, which is, of course, the appearance of corruption, whether or not that corruption exists. And I think if people were able to look at the linkage between contributions in a little bit more detail, at least, I don't think you could assuage all of these concerns, because I actually do think there are some valid concerns, but I think it would at least provide a better perspective on the issue. Unfortunately, one of the difficult issues is that lobbying is very expensive. Filling out lobbying reports and having, you know, it's not too difficult for a lot of groups to perhaps send one of their members on a specific bill, but to have someone there full-time, you know, with their ear to the ground, getting back to you about what's going on and catching everything is much more difficult. I had some similar experiences. I did some of my work, I did some surveys of organized groups, and some of them I called by phone, and I remember talking to at least one of them where I was, well, you haven't had a chance to respond to my survey. And he's like, I'm working out of my dining room. I've got all this stuff stacked up on my dining room table. This was someone in Oregon. And I don't have time, I don't have the resources, and the last time I responded to this, I felt the person felt like they had the data had been misrepresented, or not for me, of course, but and so there's a lot of concern. There are a lot of people out there who are the way I usually put it is that lobbyists are bad unless they're lobbying for the thing that you want, right? And we all have interests, right? Whether it's the environment or parks or not having smoking in public buildings, and when people are lobbying for those things, we don't view it as badly. We view the generic big corporation that we don't necessarily belong to as the problem, without putting the specific information on it. It's just a general sense of it. There's no way you can solve the fact that there's differential access to resources that allows people to lobby, and I don't think there's any way you could put a cap on lobbying activity for an individual group or category of businesses. So in that sense, I don't think that there is no simple answer to that problem, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing, at least is from my experience as state legislator, that one of the reasons lobbyists are so influential, and money's important and the relationships and all that, but another part of it is most state legislators are part-time and share a single staff person with other legislators who answers the phone and letters. So you have your expertise in your area, but you've got to vote on, I may know medicine and law, but what did I know about coal mining and hog farming and telecommunications, all the other things I had to vote on. So there's this information gap. You're looking for people to supply expertise. The lobbyists are there handing you stuff. So investing more in legislative staff so legislators have their own people who can supply the information and don't need to turn to others, I think would help a fair amount. It's not going to solve the problem because lobbyists are influential in Congress too, but I think that could make a difference.
I just want to make one point. It's not specific to lobbying, but it includes lobbying, because lobbying is speaking too. The Supreme Court in Citizens United, Justice Kennedy, said this: "We now conclude," the court said, "that independent expenditures," and that could be lobbying or it could be the kind of ads we're talking about, "we now conclude that independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption." And by corruption, they meant pay to play, quid pro quo, right? I'll buy your vote, which isn't, I think, probably a widespread problem, because most legislators are at least smart enough to know they shouldn't do that, right? The reason this is important is it is taking off the table any form of political or campaign reform that is based on an aim to respond to lack of political confidence in the system. It's not so much that people think there's a lot of bribery going on, but people don't have confidence in the system. They think it's corrupted, but at a non-bribery level. And this says that can never be a justification. That can never be a justification for legislation dealing with lobbying reform or political finance reform. I think in Citizens United, they just shut down all campaign finance and political campaign legislation efforts in this country in the future.